Hello and welcome to the first episode of Everyone's a Hypocrite, They Just Don't Know It. I am your host, a Jaded Gamer, and this series will discuss games that have seemingly become worse with each installment, be it overall quality, public opinion, or the removal of what was once considered to be a series standard. Today I will be discussing the Final Fantasy series in an overall manner regarding my history with it, a more in-depth analysis of Final Fantasy 15, and comparing it to its more recent contemporaries, 12 and 13. My history with the series starts on the SNES emulator and Final Fantasy 6 or 3, depending on which website you got the ROM from. Having been thoroughly impressed by the characters and depth of story, I later got into the PS2 version of Final Fantasy X, and at the time enjoyed it very much. Then came Final Fantasy XII. Despite not hearing about 11, I didn't hesitate to pick it up and play it through in its entirety. Later, having watched my brother play Final Fantasy XIII, I started on it as well and ended up finishing it within a week. Having done so, I decided to check out the earlier entries in the series, picking them all up from 1 to 9 on my PSV. I also gave Final Fantasy A Realm Reborn a go, pre-expansions. And that brings us to the most recent Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy 15, game that made me lose interest in the series. Before that though, a quick overview of the series' main entries. Final Fantasy I, although a decent game overall and a good jumping off point for the series, I find is mostly directionless and vague, with little beyond you good, they bad, go kill. Final Fantasy II, with its at its time unique leveling system and keyword usage, just ends up being a melange of where do I go and I sure hope I'm strong enough to deal with the next monster closet type of experience. Final Fantasy III is where it started to come together for the series, I feel, setting up much of what would become series standards such as the job system, omnipotent crystals, and a coin flip-like world to explore. Final Fantasy IV, for whatever reason, stood out the least to me when regarding the first 6 entries. When I think of it, for whatever reason, I can't seem to differentiate it from Final Fantasy II. I don't know what it is that causes this. I guess it just had such a low impact on me, the two games just blended together. Final Fantasy V, with its wonderful job system, stands out as the more versatile of the 6, giving you unparalleled choice when building up your party. It is at times a bit directionless, but this is more than made up for by not only having two different worlds to explore, but by combining the two in a real memorable moment. I do feel it falls apart towards the end with the final boss. That is a step over the way too much HP line to be a fair fight, but maybe that's the point. Final Fantasy VI is the most beloved of the early series, and for good reason. Absolutely nails everything the preceding games have put forth, with the strongest story to that point, characters both memorable and relatable, a robust magic and leveling system. Final Fantasy VII, although probably the most popular of all the games, and getting a full remake soon, is by far my most disliked of all the Final Fantasy games to date. It's slow, clunky, ugly, and worst of all, boring to play. The furthest I have gotten is past the Golden Saucer. I forced myself to play to that point, pushing through hours of tedious gameplay. For those who disagree and feel like lashing out, do so, I won't stop you. Your opinion is as valid as mine. Final Fantasy VIII I do not enjoy either. The magic draw system encourages you to stop dead, and waste hours drawing cards just so you're not screwed over later. Final Fantasy IX, although apparently a callback to the previous 8 games at the time, is a game I will never play. Not because the story's bad, not because the world's boring to explore, or because the leveling system is dull. It's because I am so past the point of sick with androgynous preteen furries who save the world, I just can't muster up the will to tap the launch button on my PSV. Final Fantasy X has been picked apart, reassembled and deconstructed to hell and back, Even though I went through a phase where I agreed entirely with the dissenting opinion that the game was just awful, it is at best decent, at worst just okay. Final Fantasy XI was the first step the company made into the MMO genre. Having played it recently to see what it's all about, all I can really say is it's a very clunky version of Final Fantasy XII. Speaking of which, Final Fantasy XII is far and away my favourite. It simultaneously scratches my MMO itch and lays down the formula for the next 3 major installments in the series, introducing the hunt system that would be prevalent thereafter, and the much coveted skip cutscene button, a huge, though unfortunately segmented world, and a story that relies less upon tropes of the series and anime in general, but more on political deception and manipulation that parallels the world we live in. Well, until the wheels fall off at the last possible moment when Vayne turns into Mecha He-Man. Can't have it all, I guess. Final Fantasy XIII seems to be the most polarizing of all. Graphically stunning and generally breathtaking, the series has never, and arguably still hasn't, looked better. Unfortunately, the game received massive backlash, and not without good reason, for its straightforward nature and what initially seems like a dumbed-down combat system. Final Fantasy XIV was perhaps the worst MMO launch in history, though I'd argue something like WildStar did worse, seeing as how there is still a community behind Final Fantasy XIV weeks after it launched, as opposed to WildStar that seemingly went free to play the next week. And yes, I'm being an arse. I felt outlining my history with the series was a worthwhile endeavour, not only to give you a view into my opinion of the series at large, but as a generalisation of what the series has been to this point. And that brings us to Final Fantasy XV, the game that made me dislike the series, and the long drawn-out jumping-off point for the subject of this video. The game starts out with a jump forward to the Ifrit boss for a brief moment, seemingly only to say, "Don't worry, the game gets better." It then returns to the current time and opens the game proper, by making you listen to an out-of-place song while pushing what turns out to be both the best and worst part of this game, the regalia. I am aware that anime has popularised using out-of-place music, but here it just doesn't work as there's nothing to compare it to and no build-up for it. You arrive at a garage called the Hammerhead and meet Cindy, or as she should have been called, Sydney. Not only would that have complemented the long-running character named Sid, but in the Japanese version of this game, she was called Sydney, so I guess we just can't have nice things. And here we are hit with the first problem of the game, the numerous non-choices. You are immediately railroaded into doing a job with Cindy while your car is fixed up, even though it just ran out of gas. That costs no more than 10 gil. You are tasked with killing some vermin and given no option but to accept. Although this works well as a small tutorial for the combat system, I think that could have been handled better by just letting the player explore on their own for a while. Upon returning to Hammerhead, with your job completed, your car has been fixed, and you are given another non-option to deliver something on your way to a seaside resort. This starts a worrying trend for the game. You are often prompted in dialogue with story-based NPC conversations to pick between several seemingly different options that will affect the outcome. However, without fail, this never steers a conversation into a direction of your choosing, but instead always results in the predetermined outcome and throws a meaningless, tiny bonus your way for wearing your big boy pants and being an individual with individual opinions. These choices are prevalent throughout the game and don't just affect dialogue, they also intrude on combat in large set-piece boss fights, with pointless, go-nowhere QTE sequences that have the illusion of a choice or consequence. Having been forced to deliver the package you didn't have a choice to deliver, you arrive at the resort on the coast and are told of a strange island that is off in the distance that is never brought up again until 45 hours later. Well, that's how long it took for me to get there. Your time may vary. Fun fact, upon seeing this island for the first time, I instantly thought it looked like the long dead remains of Sin from Final Fantasy X. and from that point on started associating similarities between the two. Entering the restaurant at the resort, you are spoken to the most unremarkable villain in Final Fantasy history. So much so, I completely forgot about him until he randomly showed up a good 20 hours later when I got to Lestalem. After that, you were once again given a non-option to do a job for some New York stereotype, who is so far out of place in this game. There must have been a New York City at one point that was cut from the game, but this character somehow was not removed with it. You go to get his request and come across a gigantic zoo that was shown earlier. It is sleeping between you and your goal. The game forces you into slow, sneaky mode here, but again, pointless. Even if you try to wake it up, you can't. It just wakes up when it's supposed to, and then takes flight and forces the camera onto it, despite what the player may want. After that heart-pounding venture, you are put up in a 10,000 gil room for the night, for free. You awake to news that Insomnia, your capital city, which was called Insomnia, only so they can make a pun out of it later with a story quest name, has been invaded, and your father killed by the big bad empire, seemingly the same one from Final Fantasy VI, Magitech and Ripoff Kefka included. You race home and avoid a roadblock using a side road. Here I thought I had the option to either take the back road or the main road, so I turned, ran towards the blockade, ready to unleash all my pent-up rage that Noctis has had in him upon hearing the news, and I'm immediately turned around and told the developers didn't want to program that. Once all that is over, you're pushed towards discovering the power of kings, the power that flows in your veins, and much like Noctis's power to warp both long and short distances, it is never explained beyond that. On your way, you meet several potentially interesting characters, but because the game is open world, I completely forgot who they were until they showed up tens of hours later to say hi again. I may be giving the impression that this game is as linear as a pencil, and that's because it is, but this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Stories are linear, books are linear, movies are linear. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is how stories are written. And when you include an open world with your story, it can lead to a massive problem. By giving the player choice over where they go, what they do, and if they pay attention to the main story at all, creates a monster that looms over the player the entire time. There is a fine line for balance, and it simply cannot be struck by the majority of players, all with different agendas as how they play or enjoy games. Do I think this game could be saved by bringing it more in line with Final Fantasy XIII, a game that it was severed from like a dead limb? Of course not, but following through and giving the player some choices that actually skew the story path, even in minor ways, would have somewhat justified the choice they made to make this game open world, at least in some small part in my mind. Anyways, having claimed the power of kings from your ancestors, you assault an Imperial base, killing an NPC boss that speaks like you have a history, but, well, don't, as far as I know. And from here on out, about 80% of the explorable world is opened up to you, and on my first playthrough, I wanted to explore. It's the main reason I play games, because you can't do this shit in real life without incurring massive costs in time and money, or because it's illegal, or simply because it's not possible with human limitations. I spent probably 40 hours chipping away at the fog of war, while occasionally doing story missions, and I don't think I'm alone in doing this based on the opinions I've taken in of others about this game.
That sounds way cool. I'm actually looking forward to this. Say I can recreate.
When I did finally get back to the main quest, I had forgotten every NPC I'd met to this point, and those that were meant to be meaningful or important were completely lost on me. Take the encounter with the villain on the Outlook when you go to see the crater from afar. By the way, I can't even recall his name upon writing this. He was that unremarkable to me. He just turns up out of nowhere like he does every time he's on screen, and says that he can get you into the crater with the Titan. He does this by giving you another non-option regarding who will drive there. When the driving section starts, you are prompted that if you lose sight of him, you will fail and it's game over. It was at this time, naive as I was, I sat up and got ready for something exciting to happen en route. But of course, nothing did. I just held the drive button and it did the rest for me. Once at the crater, you find a king's tomb, just there on a precarious cliff face because I guess the developers needed to include X amount in the main storyline. Once claimed, the cliff breaks away and we check off another cliché on our bingo sheet. Noctis is left hanging for his life as Gladios tries to pull him up with a QTE. A QTE that will just hang there forever until you press the button enough times. If you stop halfway through, it resets and just waits. When you make it to the Titan, the fight consists of waiting for the QTE to happen. After a while the Empire shows up and starts shooting at a bunch for some reason. If they are trying to capture it, the little hooks they are using are not going to work on a literal Titan. And if they are trying to help Noctis, why do they attack him? I guess the developers just wanted it to look cool. After this happens for a while, the boss starts the final QTE section. Your mates freeze it using ice bombs that they apparently have, and you're prompted with another QTE to finish it off. A QTE that will do itself if you just wait. Why even include it if it's just going to do it itself? After the fight is over, you're offered help by the villain again so that you don't burn to death. This is the one and only non-option I agree with in the entire game. As for what happens between that and the next part of the story, it's never explained. Why does the villain just let you get away? Why doesn't the Empire try and stop you? Who knows? I guess it was deemed unimportant. It just loads main story _next.ps4 and continues. Here you are told by the totally doesn't sound like genitals Gentiana to go get the cut content lightning boss summon. Once done by touching 3 magic stones, you go to get your car back that was apparently stolen by the Imperials after you abandoned it without a second thought in the crater level. With that done, you drive back to Lestalem and clip right through the bridge because the PS4 can't keep up. Once the game's done totaling your car and puts you back on the road, it's time to complain about the next thing. The character, Iris, joins you for a brief moment. It would seem like she, and many others for that matter, were meant to be optional party members selectable throughout the journey, but were cut or lopped off for DLC purposes later on. As for Iris herself, she looks, moves and speaks like a stereotyped otaku's wet dream jailbaiting waifu. She sticks out like a sore thumb when compared to any other NPCs in the game. It's really off-putting is what I'm getting at. On the way to the next destination, the group decides for you that you're going to stop and fuck up another Imperial base. During this assault you capture a captain, and no less than a minute after doing so, Ignis informs you that he escaped, and your efforts were in vain. Of all the content they clearly removed from this game, why did they leave this in? It just baffles me. After beating up a Final Fantasy VI Magitech armor in the center of the base, you encounter Ariana. She challenges you to a fight, and on my first playthrough, she bugged out so hard she leapt into the air, got stuck on a catwalk, and I could hold the circle button to win like I do in every other single fight. After that, you drive towards the holiday house, and are stopped forcefully 3 times, then asked if you want to stop and take a break, and go exploring. However, on my first playthrough, I'd already done all this. I'd been around the entire map by this point, and if they didn't want players doing that, then they shouldn't have made it an open world game. Once arriving at the holiday house, you're given the option to grow carrots, and only carrots, because if this game needed something, it was carrot growing. You were then informed in order to fix the boat to progress the story, you need to go and get some mithril. Despite having several weapons and accessories made out of the stuff, it's apparently the wrong type, and I've got to go to the other side of the map to get some of the right type. Once there, you run into the villain, again, and he helps you out, again, for totally no reason at all. He pairs you with Ariana, who was seemingly included in this game only because people like boobs and dragoons, I guess. You head into a dungeon, and have it pointed out to you that you are in fact underwater, even though you're not. And did they think to use this in any sort of clever way by having you move in and out of bodies of water, maybe in slow motion or whatever? Of course not. Don't be silly. With the mithril in hand, you return and head to El Tissa, the French Venice of this world apparently. Must be right next to the New York of this world too, where that Dino guy came from. You spend all of 5 minutes here running around, being interrupted by Prompto wanting to take pictures and shit, and being pushed towards the monster arena. And before I forget, which I did about 5 times while writing this script, you meet Gentiana at the overpriced hotel and she tells you you can warp back in time to the other continent. More on this later. Next you meet with a city official, make about 5 consecutive non-choices, literally do nothing. At all. Why did they bother? You come to the agreement that your buddies will do shit off camera, Ignis will have his eyes blown up, and it happens off screen because apparently the gold standard for this game is tell, don't show. During the next QTE set piece, Luna pulls an Aerith and gets her guts ripped out by the villain. On the subject of Lady Unifreya Nox Fleur, I can't help but think she's just filling the role Una did in Final Fantasy X, going around getting approval from spiritual beings. She's kept out of the game so much that she may as well not be in it in my humble opinion. Anyways, the Leviathan roars at your bunch, but you go Super Saiyan because Krillin got blowed up. And there's more QTEs that just don't matter. Topped off by the final one that if you just wait, the game does it for you yet again. And the boss says, yeah, okay, I'll work for you, and that's about it. The next level loads. The Noctis is all sad because his girlfriend died, as he should be, but his mates are like bros before hoes, and don't let him grieve. Come to think of it, Noctis didn't get a chance to grieve his father either. His friends are a bunch of wankers. You're then given the chance to wander around the train while the next real level loads. Once it does, you're given the option of taking Ignis, the most recently blinded member of your team, with you on the next tomb hunt. And by given the option, I mean given the non-option. It doesn't matter what you say, he comes with you regardless. It's just another pretend choice for toddlers. Ignis stumbles around, slows you down, as any recently blinded person would. But despite not wanting him to come along, you're the one who gets yelled at for doing what you came there to do. When you reach the boss room, the clearly telegraphed boss room, a series staple, the Malboro, shows up. But much like the Titan and Leviathan, you can't actually defeat it until the game lets you. Ignis suddenly decides that he's blind Batman and throws an explosive inside the Malboro and it blows up. So now he's just as useful as he was when he wasn't blind. How convenient. With that done, you jump back on the train and head dangerously close to Final Fantasy XIII territory. A whole way. The Empire assaults the train and Noctis ends up on top of it, making good use of his unexplained warping powers for the first and only time in the game. He then ends up pushing Prompto the Photo Guyo off the train because the villain can apparently manipulate the flow of time and has several cosplay outfits with him at all times. It's also never explained. Not even remotely. One long loading scene later and the Leviathan shows up out of nowhere, saves your ass from a bunch of non-threatening demons in a tunnel. You then turn up at more cut content and hop straight back on the train for the next loading scene. The snow level is next and you find the giant corpse of the snow goddess and are attacked by a rave party with too many glow sticks. Then the villain tries to kill you but fails because Genitals turns up and saves you. Then the villain magically turns off your weapons. It may as well be magic, it doesn't attempt to explain it. Arriving at the big bad guy's city, you find the tracks are unusable and instead use the regalia to drive past the outer defences. I know I've been coming down hard on this game, but when they get it right, they really get it right. The following minute or so is probably the best I had in the game. Driving through the broken tracks and dodging the oncoming fire is the only reason I like the car being included in the game. Other than that, it may as well not be there for all I care about it. It just ends up being a quick travel button otherwise. Well, with that behind us, Noctis is split up from the other two in the most obvious collapsing debris set piece I've ever seen in a game, and is left to progress on his own. But don't worry too much, he remembers he has the ring of unexplained OPness in his pocket, so any fear or tension that may be there for you is completely removed in seconds. At some point, and yes, that's as accurate as I want to be, Noctis walks into a trap that the villain clearly states is a trap. It may as well have a 10-foot tall neon flashing sign above it. But surprise, surprise, Noctis is saved by his two buddies he lost contact with at the start of the level, once again removing all fret and tension from the scene. You then rescue Prompto and come across a machine that magically stops you holding your weapons. You turn it off and... that's about it. You then fight the kinda half-demon version of Luna's brother, but get overwhelmed by demons after the fight and abandon your friends to die as you go to confront the villain on your own. Regarding Luna's brother, he's clearly set up as a villain earlier and even shows you his power to the party by one-shotting Gladios. But he comes around to seeing how he is being manipulated and chooses to follow Noctis as the rightful king. Too bad this all happens in cutscenes with no interaction and is rendered pointless by having him become a villain anyways. It's like the story writers wanted to do everything and ended up with nothing. Anyways, you go to confront the villain. He tricks you into touching the crystal, which sucks you into it for some reason, while Noctis screams over plot-critical dialogue that the villain is expositioning at you. When that's over, Noctis wakes up in an ether, or a void, or whatever this game wants to call it, and is confronted by Bahamut of the cut content. You later awake on that island that was mentioned once and only once, 60 hours prior, for some reason, and realise that the game did a time skip on you. Fortunately, Luna's dog brought Sid's boat for you, just so the writers didn't write themselves into a corner and could put you on a cool island. You sail it. Wait, do you sail speedboats? I don't know, whatever. You end up at the resort and fight for your life with the vague hope you will find someone to give you answers to the numerous questions this cold opening has no doubt left you with. And as you progress, more powerful demons appear. Even one of my favourites, a demon wall, though it's in no way nearly as threatening as it was in Final Fantasy XII. When I first encountered it, I was unable to defeat it, so I decided to come back and fight it later, given this was clearly the endgame section. Or so I thought at the time. Not 10 seconds later, you're stopped at the top of the hill by some guy in a car, and he offers to drive you to Hammerhead. You're going there anyway, may as well. Not like you have a choice. While driving there, a ton of exposition is dumped on you, and you see powerful demons outside the car all the way there. I mean, previously the car would have had to stop and you'd have to take them out because they get in your way, but here they just wave at you as you go by. Don't even have the option to wave back. Once at Hammerhead, you expect to meet up with all the people in the game that you've met prior, or at least the ones that were mentioned in the exposition car ride. Hell, even just the owner of the garage. But no, you speak to your best buddies and that's it. There's nothing else to do here besides purchase a few consumables. Then you head off to the final level. They've really done their best to follow through on the tell don't show rule of this game. Once there, you fight your way to the Ifrit battle. It's decent, a bit drawn out, and can only be killed with 2 summons. One of which happens mid-battle and at a certain health threshold, and the other that you simply have to use, otherwise the battle never ends. You can get him down to 0 HP and he just keeps on going. You then head up to the final boss, but before entering, the game forces you to choose a picture from your journey. And if you're like me, you didn't take one or save one, so you get to pick from 2 defaults that are forced upon you throughout the game. Regarding this choice, I think originally they intended to use the notebook that you and Luna filled out during your adventures, but for whatever reason this seemed to be completely pushed to the side and forgotten. Anyways, upon entering the throne room, the big bad casts Megadeth on your companions. Noctis doesn't even seem to care that his friends who have helped him through his entire life and all its hardships just carked it right in front of him. As a side note, the villain has also strung up the bodies of all those that have died in his wake, all the named ones anyway. But the way I played, spending 90% of the time exploring the world and ignoring the story, I didn't even recognise one of them. Noctis says to the villain, "I don't like you," then warps no less than a mile down to the street to fight what's his name. They both flip-flop around for a little bit, then Noctis goes Super Saiyan and the fight's over in a matter of seconds. Or at least it was for me. And the game says, "Hang on, you've got a bunch of king weapons. Let's use them." And you get to press the circle button about 10 times, watching while the bad guy does nothing to stop you. Or you don't do anything and watch the game do it for you, because QTEs are just too hard. With that done, you return to the Ether Thingo by super killing yourself with the king's weapons and double kill the villain with all your dead mates, and what is the best example of why even bother including it that I can find in this game. At the start of the cutscene you take absolutely no interaction with, before everyone takes a pound of flesh from the villain, it's Noctis' turn, and the game once again says, "Here's a QTE, you do it." The thing is, if you just let the QTE sit, it is drawn out over 30 seconds. Then instead of having the villain research with power, or missing your chance to stop him forever, a little Windows paperclip pops up, sees that you're having trouble, and does it for you. The game does it for you. Why even include it if it doesn't matter? As for the ending of the game, the fans in their infinite wisdom have concocted a theory to explain all this, but like 90% of fan theories, quickly devolves into it was all a dream, or he was dead all along, or it's a coma, or whatever. It's always the same thing. So I'm just completely discounting any other possibilities here. The people behind this game have shown that they're not interested in giving you any other possibilities throughout the entire game, so why should I think more about it than I already have? And with that massively drawn out blow by blow of the game, my thoughts are more or less summed up. Now let's get on with the rest of the video. The comparison. To further justify my previously mentioned issues with the game, I will now compare Final Fantasy XV with its 2 most recent contemporaries, 12 and 13. In order to do so, I will now go over the combat, characters, world, and a generalization of the story. Let's start with what has always been a pretty standard part of the games, the combat. Final Fantasy XV's combat breaks away from the traditional, continuous turn-based style the vast majority of the games in the series have used. It instead allows for free movement with a dumbed-down hold the attack button to attack and hold the evade button to evade. It adds to this by allowing directional input, to use preset attack animations, or to allow you to parry and get a free strike back. You can also call your allies to use a skill with a QTE at the end to add a bit more damage, or warp distances to strike your target for a damage multiplier. And there is also the hold the button to win summons ability that you get later on in the game. Apparently there is also a wait mode, but like other parts of the game, it is so poorly implemented and explained to the player, I didn't know about it until I started looking things up for this review. Final Fantasy XIII's combat is by far the most traditional of the three games I am comparing. It offers up the continuous, classic turn-based combat while only allowing direct control over the main character of your choosing. It also includes a job-shifting mechanic, allowing for in-the-moment swapping to counter the continuously changing situation in combat. The combat options themselves range from the auto-battle button, and if you use this button, you have only yourself to blame, the pick it yourself button, and the techniques button for very situational skills, such as chain building AoEs or summoning abilities. I feel the reason most people dislike the combat in this game is due to the fact they just use the auto battle button. The button always picks the weakest but most appropriate option based on the situation and the role you were in. Once I realised this, I started using the pick it yourself button and found I was far more effective in most battles, and battles that previously gave me problems no longer did. The game also forgoes critical hits, which have become so prevalent in gaming lately. Some games base their entire DPS system around it. Just look at insert MMO name here for an example. In place of a stock standard critical system, a chain building system was used. This method makes the player work to build a chain on an opponent. Once maxed out, they become vulnerable and take up to 999% more damage. By simply removing the percent chance to crit, the player has become more involved. Final Fantasy XII's combat is very niche. It combines free movement with a continuous turn-based style while having a single-player MMO feel to it. Combat relies on gambits, microbits of code input by the player that play actions when triggered. I tend to rely a lot upon auto attacks, saving my MP for healing or AoE spells. The game offers many different types of weapons to handle an array of situations. There isn't really much more to the combat, it's just simple and effective. The only gripe I have with the combat is when it begins or concludes. You draw or sheath your weapon, making you stop in your tracks every time. It breaks the flow enough to bother me. It also prevents interactions with world objects. Before starting this section proper, I would like to put forth the argument that all Final Fantasy games have been open world. You initially start closed off, and it opens as you play. Think it over while this section plays out. Final Fantasy XV's world is massive and offers about 90% of it to the player within a couple of hours of storyline progression. The size of it is also the main problem with it. You start in a desert area and later move on to a foresty, marshy, everything else kind of area, and it all feels the same from there on. There is very little to discover or is of any interest beyond, a quest, or that looks nice. The majority of the world just consists of empty calorie trash fights and empty space. There is a day-night cycle, with stronger opponents appearing at night. You can camp to pass the time, and are able to eat meals for buffs. Like most open worlds, the story comes second, and hurts this game far more than anything else does. The world can be traversed by car, chocobo, or on foot, none of which are particularly interesting. Car is dull. All you do is hold a button to drive, and tap the direction if you need to pick one, or you can just let the game do it for you like it does everything else. Chocobos, although faster than walking, feels floaty, and for some reason they swap the controls around, such as the jump button, and you have to dismount to pick up anything or interact with something in the world. Regarding the end game, I didn't even realise there was one. It was so poorly explained through the use of Umbra. When you get to Altissia, I completely ignored it and kept playing. I am more than willing to admit that was my fault for not realising it. but if the developers aren't able to convey important information to the player, then I feel they are just as much at fault. Final Fantasy XIII's world is very linear from the get-go. It later opens up more, offering mid and end-game content. The world itself looks consistently amazing and rarely drops a ball through its entire run. It spans over many different environments and adds a couple of unique ones, such as the musical tower. The world can be traversed by walking, by chocobo, or by warping by doing late game quests to open the options. Final Fantasy XII's world feels massive but is sadly segmented due to it being limited by the PlayStation 2 it was originally developed for. The environments are massively varied but tend to focus more on arid or desert type zones. The world can be traversed by foot, time-limited chocobos that can access hidden areas, or by warping between save crystals, and much later on using an airship in a similar manner. The game has plenty to do, be it side quests, hidden areas, and you never really push towards it. It's just something you come across. There's no marker saying, come here, do this. You just find it on your own, and that's rewarding in itself. Final Fantasy XV's main cast in no way interests me. The developers seemingly did everything they could, in both design and voice acting, to put me off liking them. The sub-characters of the game vary from hillbilly sluts to regal snobs. I've already mentioned my thoughts on this previously with the Iris character, but to confirm my thoughts, every character in this game is heavily stereotyped. Advancing levels in this game does little but give you more HP and MP. The game knows this by allowing a level 1 challenge run should you wish it, but gaining AP is by far more effective, allowing damage limits to be broken and new skills to be learned. Final Fantasy XIII's characters stand out visually for the most part, but a couple of them are very annoying and would have been better off left out. However, they all interlink well and bounce off each other as the story progresses. The sub-characters range from finger-tenting cackling villains to cackling villains who tent their fingers. The leveling system in the game is an embarrassment. It is a linear series of plus to stats and occasionally new skills. It was meant to be tailored to work with the story, but it in no way works well. Final Fantasy XII's cast of misfits work very well together for the most part. I do feel, though, Van and Penelo could have been dropped to absolutely no repercussions story-wise. The rest, however, all have history between them in one way or another, and watching that come out through the story and gameplay always draws me in. The sub-characters in the game all serve their parts well enough while doing their best not to take the spotlight. In the original release of the game, you were free to choose the direction your characters took, but this without fail always ended up with them being jacks of all trades, masters of every. The revised Zodiac edition of the game makes you pick from presets and gives the characters an overall more defined role. However, I do prefer the original's method, as I tend to pick free characters I like and just go with it. Final Fantasy XV's story is a mess from start to finish, with very obvious parts that were lopped off and other parts that were seemingly forced in. There are also many characters that show up once and then not again for tens of hours later. Parts of the game have clearly been removed for DLC purposes, like when Gladios stops you outside the beach house and tells you to insert your credit card so you can find out how he got the new scar. Final Fantasy XIII's story doesn't fare much better than 15's. A lot of what is mentioned or shown is glossed over, never to be brought up again. However, there is a data log included in the game where you can go to find the answers, even if it's inconvenient, but at least it's in the game, unlike Final Fantasy XV, where they expect you to either go online or watch the 2 movies they produced. If it's not included in the game, I'm not going to bother. Final Fantasy XII's story is far and away the best that has ever been put into a Final Fantasy game. The story focuses on a kingdom caught between two warring factions and the politics that end up playing a greater part than the battles themselves, much like the world we live in. It is let down a bit by introducing godlike entities into the game later on, and the final boss going all anime on you ruins what is otherwise a very satisfying end to a wonderfully well told story. Furthermore, I feel that most, if not everything, is explained well within the game, and doesn't rely on you having to look it up in a logbook or log on to the internet to find it. With all that I have outlined here, I hope it is clear how Final Fantasy XV does not in any way resemble its contemporaries in a vast majority of ways. Be it an open, empty world, a story chopped to bits and sewn back together, a shallow combat system with little room for improvement, pointless dialogue decisions, unremarkable story characters, and why did they even bother including them QTEs? I feel that it is inarguable that this game fails to live up to a series this established. And yes, I'm not blind to the other game's failings, but I can't help but feel that they are still worthy of the title. I think that this is a turning point for the series, much like Final Fantasy X was when compared to its contemporaries. If it continues this way, I feel that the series is in for a big failing in the future. Hypothetically, if the series released something in the future like the recent Metal Gear Survive, which is a clear cash grab using repurposed assets and hidden developer messages saying the series is dead, would you buy it just because of the name? Well, that's how I feel about Final Fantasy XV. I feel like my money was taken, and I was given something that barely resembles what the title suggests. I am a Jaded Gamer. Thank you for watching.